Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Russell, it is a pleasure to have you back on the show. Last time you talked about JFK, then the time before that you were on about World War II, and then you were on before that about JFK. So we're going to keep it even and let's just stick to World War II this discussion, but it's a pleasure to have you back on the show, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Robbie. It's a pleasure to be back.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about some of the trials and some of just my interest in World War II kind of sparked up recently, and I wanted to learn more, I guess, from your perspective, where you're getting your source material from. What are you basing a lot of your information from history collections? And obviously, you visited to some of these places as well, too, to be able to check out their archives and see material that the public probably can't have access to.
That's true. Yes, that's absolutely right. If you want to have a word about my sources, um, most of the trials that I'm looking at are British trials. So they were tried by British courts, although they were tried in Germany. And that means that the records of the trials are all here in our National Archives in Kew in London. So that's where most of my material comes from. I travel there quite frequently. In fact, on the jacket of my next book, The Curio House Trials, it says that I live there part-time, which is more or less true. I do spend an awful lot of time down in London. I live in Cambridge, so it's not very far away. It's not a hardship, but that's certainly where I spend a lot of time. I have visited plenty of the sites too. One of the best visits I had was to a large concentration camp just outside Hamburg called Neuengamme, and I spent some time with the director of the archive there, and he gave me open access to his archive, which is absolutely enormous. He has a record of nearly every prisoner that went through the camp, and that's thousands of prisoners that went, tens of thousands that went through, and that was a very good source of information. Of course, I read a lot of books. Books are not sworn testimony, though, are they? And that's what's key about these trials. They are sworn testimony, very helpful in actually establishing points. Of course, there were trials run by the Americans, and their records are in your National Archives in Washington. I haven't got to those yet, simply because I started doing this shortly after COVID when it was difficult to travel. And I now find there is a mountain of materials for me here, probably about, I was trying to work out, I've probably got about 15 years worth of material to go through on the books that I want to write. And let me just show you this. This is practically the only book that's been written about the Belsen trial in any great detail. You can see this. It's an old book. It's 80 years old, and you can see how hefty that one is already, and that's on one trial for Belsen. So this is
Wait,
a very good
one of
source.
the three, right? One of the three?
One of the three trials. That's right, Robbie. Yeah, there were three trials. In fact, the first British military trial was Belsen 1, as we call it, because it was the first trial. They tried 44 people for the crimes, not just in Belsen, but Auschwitz as well. They discovered, as the investigators looked at the case, that quite a lot of the people they'd indicted also worked in Auschwitz, and quite a lot of the people they got testimony from had also been in Auschwitz before being transferred to Belsen. So they were in fact charged on two charges, one relating to the deaths and the ill treatment of people in Belsen, but the second on the ill treatment and deaths of people in Auschwitz. So some people have called it the Belsen Auschwitz trial. The second trial, having tried 44 people, and used interpreters for half a dozen different languages, they found it was extremely difficult. Every question had to be interpreted into one or more languages. Every answer had to be interpreted into one or more languages, which really extended the whole process. In the first trial, lasted 2 months. And so they made some decisions after that trial that they weren't going to try more than 8 people at the same time. And they were only going to try people who spoke the same language. So they didn't get into this massive interpretation problem. So the second trial was for, I'm just having a look, there's 8 people. And the third trial was for just one person. In between those, though, there was a fourth trial in that kind of included evidence against people in Auschwitz because not Auschwitz, sorry, Belsen, because this was the trial of what they called a capo, who was a prisoner functionary who'd worked at Belsen, and he was tried at a different location in Nuremberg. So really, strictly speaking, there were four trials, but only three have become known as a Belsen trial.
Can I
Does that make
ask yeah, can I ask what differs from each trial? Like obviously the first one to me when I was reading it, it seemed like it had the most information that would be available to read about. If you're looking at just online sources, if you type in the Belsen trials. But isn't that where like is it 13 or 18 people were hung and most of it was SS officers that were involved in there and the ones that we talked where you mentioned about serving at also Auschwitz as well too. I think they called one of them the Beast of Belsen.
Yeah. Well, the first trial, 44 people, I think 9 people were executed. Quite a lot of people, at least that number, maybe more, were acquitted. And then the people in between got sentences between 15, sorry, life imprisonment and 1 year. Um, so that is the one that there is most material about because it involves the most senior people at the camps. So the commandant of Belsen was arrested, which is very rare. The commandant had usually scarpered, as we say. He'd usually left the camp days before anybody liberated it, knowing that he was culpable for the crimes committed there. But Kramer, he remained at Belsen, and some people think that he remained because he thought he'd done nothing wrong. And that's certainly what he said in his testimony. Hey, I was just an administrator. I didn't do anything. He'd also been the commandant.
If you read some of his testimony, he talks about it, and the way he talks about it was I was a soldier doing his like he had pride in that the fact that he was just following orders and doing his whole thing, which makes it like, do you not realize what you're doing?
I know, I know. I mean, I do sort of have a wry smile occasionally when some of the usual defenses get made. I was following superior orders. I was merely an admin clerk, you know. The guy was the commandant of Auschwitz-Birkenau, which was where the trains came in every day and where the major gas chambers were. 4 gas chambers were there. 2,000 people would come in on a train, and where he thought they went to, I have no idea. He said he had nothing to do with the gas chambers, and he wondered whether it was right that people were sent there. But since he had nothing to do with it, that's as much as his questioning went. He claimed he was merely an administrator at that camp, where 1 million people died.
Do you
Um,
think a lot of the reason why these people got kind of let go or didn't really get charged for obviously put to death or anything was because of the fact that they couldn't try them on certain things like crimes against humanity and other things that were being placed on the Nuremberg trials? It seems like this one was exempt for some reason. And I think they signed some type of ceasefire or something like that, that they wouldn't be charged for certain crimes if they gave up or willingly went along to being persecuted. But then, there's a whole bunch of confusion there.
yeah, Belsen was kind of given up, if you like, to the Allies. What happened was there was an outbreak of typhus in the camp. A lot of people were very ill, and the Germans realized that if the British who were fighting towards the camp were to come across it and let all these prisoners out, that all of their own civilians in the area would catch typhus. Probably the army would catch typhus. Probably the British would catch typhus, and there'd be this huge outbreak of this terrible disease. And so what they did was they approached the commanders of the British Army who were near to the gates of the camp and said, and when I say near, I mean a few kilometers away, but they approached them with white flags flying and said, "Look, can we have a truce surrounding this camp? We'll give it to you without fighting, if you're not fighters over it," and that was agreed. There was a kind of exclusion perimeter put around the camp over which neither side would fight. Um, but I mean, the Germans were still fighting in the area up to the 13th of April. And it wasn't until the 15th that the British actually reached the camp to liberate it. Um,
Now, when did Belsen take place compared to the Nuremberg trials?
okay, the Belsen trial.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Belsen trial started on the 17th of October and finished on the 17th of November. Is that right? Yeah, that's right. Oh, hang on a sec. 17th of September. It was a 2 month trial. I know it finished on the 17th of October because it was the Friday before the Nuremberg trials started on the Monday the 20th.
So it finished before.
Yeah, but only just. I mean, it was 3 days before,
Do you
and
think we
there
don't
was
really
a
know
big
about,
push.
yeah, do you think we really don't know about the Belsen trials because of the fact that it was so before the main giant thing that everyone knows about in the history books? I mean, if you really examine the Belsen trials, it's, I would say a forward, not a forward thinker, but it paved the way for what became the Nuremberg trials. I mean, one thing that I thought was really interesting was the amount of footage that they had that was eventually used. The first that was used ever in one of these trials was the footage of what they were able to get from the camps and used in court against these people.
Yeah, well, the Belsen trial was kind of uniquely British, if you like, in that it was the first time the British had ever come across a concentration camp, and the appalling scenes that they encountered there were filmed by the British Army Film Unit, and made into these newsreels, which is what you're seeing, to be shown back here in the UK. And I'm not sure how much they were shown worldwide. And certainly the trial was it was so long and so drawn out that the British press was very interested at the beginning and quickly lost interest until the end when the sentences were read. And there was a big push at the end to get it finished before Nuremberg started, because everybody knew that Nuremberg was going to be the big event of the year, really, as far as trials of Nazis was concerned. So whether it overshadowed Nuremberg or Nuremberg overshadowed Belsen, I wouldn't say so in the UK. Certainly, Belsen is kind of seared into the minds of people here of a certain age, and most people don't know there was a trial, but everybody knows about the camp.
Uh, when it comes to the Belsen trials, what were the conditions of the camp? I mean, every camp, I'm sure you came across this, but every concentration camp had some sense of function. It sounds dark putting it that way, but each camp had a certain appeal to it. When I mean in the sense that it was doing something, whether it was an exchange camp, whether it was an industry camp for labor to death. But the Belsen camp, I mean, what were the conditions like? What was the purpose of the camp? Was it an exchange camp?
It kind of changed its purpose throughout the years. It began as a Russian POW camp, but practically all the Russian POWs were killed, prisoners of war. Then there was an idea that certain Jewish people might be valuable to exchange, or hostages, really. They were called exchange Jews, and they were kept there. So they were kept in, not too awful circumstances, because there's no point in trying to exchange people who are dying or dead. Um, and then there was an idea that it might be a place that sick people from other concentration camps could be sent to recover. So there was a kind of a hospital built there, very rudimentary hospital. And why anybody thought that people they were killing in other camps would be sent to get better in a third camp, I have no idea. But eventually, what happened was, as the camps in the east were being threatened by Russian advances, the Nazis decided, the Germans decided that they'd march the people out of them, but still keep them somewhere, and that somewhere was Belsen. So they kept shipping people to Belsen, trainloads, thousands and thousands of people from different camps turned up, and uh, the the commandant really, he didn't try very hard, but as the numbers increased, he increasingly couldn't cope. Um, the food supply went down. It dwindled in the end to nothing. There was no food coming in. The water pumps failed, because the electricity failed, and he did nothing to alleviate that except for fill up some concrete ponds with some water, which he put barbed wire around, and nobody could get access to them. And eventually, people trying to get access to them fell into them, and there were bodies in them, so they were useless as supplies of water. Um, and people became ill. They were terribly overcrowded. And when one person became ill with typhus, because it's borne by fleas and lice, then the person next to them became infected, and eventually tens of thousands of people were sick. When the British liberated the camp, they hadn't been fed for at least a week. There was no water, and nearly everybody was ill. In fact, I have some numbers here. I'm just going to read them to you. So they estimated there were 40,000 people left in the camp. Tens of thousands of people had already died. 40,000 people in the camp. 13,000 corpses were littering the camp. Of those 40,000 people alive, 28,000 people needed hospital treatment. And 10,000 would die anyway, even if they were given the treatment. So there was this huge catastrophe that presented itself to the British as they went into this camp. They were expecting a slightly worse prisoner of war camp, and what they got was this mass of people who were starving and dying.
How did they
It
have the
was
right
awful.
reaction to be able to help those people? I mean, if you know the story about the when they freed a lot of people from Auschwitz, they first thing these people wanted to do was eat. And when they started eating, they ate way too much because you haven't had food in forever, and they ended up dying because they fed themselves too much. So it's like a healthy balance. I mean, how did the British handle this situation that they were put in, where they liberate this camp thinking it's going to be some beaten up people for sure? We'll have medics on hand, but then they come and see these atrocities. I mean, bodies on top of bodies, people starving, children starving, skin or bones ripping through the skin.
Yeah, it was. I mean, the first people into the camp were the ordinary British soldiers, if you like. And of course, they were appalled and just gave all their rations away. Everything they got, they gave away. And their food kitchens that came up behind them, they were a fighting group of soldiers. They were anti-tank artillery that came up behind them and just gave all their food to these poor people. But it was too rich. And there's no doubt that many people died from that first wave of eating stuff that they couldn't really stomach. But it was quickly realized that that was going to happen, and the food and the water situation was taken under control pretty quickly. I mean, for instance, by May, the British has set up a hospital of 13,000 beds, which is the biggest hospital in Europe, and might have been the biggest hospital in the world at the time. 13,000 beds, and they had this procedure where they took a person, they decided there was kind of triage, who's the most sick person that we can save. They would take them from one of the huts to a different part of the camp, wash them and clean them and put them in clean blankets, take them in the hospital and start to feed them the type of food that they could retain. There were some problems about that the type of food that they could feed them, because at first the British tried what they called I think they called it the Bengal menu, which was a kind of starvation relief that they'd given to people in India, but it was far too sweet for the palate of the people in Europe, and they just wouldn't eat it. So they had to come up with another sort of foodstuff for them. But eventually they did that, and although there's no doubt 10,000 people died after the British got there that they just couldn't save. They were already too emaciated or too ill to survive. But thousands of people were saved, thank goodness,
What
through
was
this feeding and medicine.
what was the evidence that they used during the trial for the Belsen camp?
Well,
Was it
evidence is,
largely eyewitness stuff or was it any physical evidence?
yeah, well, they started by establishing the conditions. So they used British military people to say what they found when they went into the camp. So if you establish the conditions, then you can charge people with being responsible for those conditions. And then they used eyewitness evidence. That was very difficult to come by. So you've got to imagine that the people they used to give evidence generally come from Auschwitz. They were survivors of Auschwitz, which was pretty lucky to survive Auschwitz in the first place, right? Then they come to Belsen, where they'd survived disease and starvation. So there weren't that many of them. Not that many people survived enough to give evidence and were willing to give evidence. So imagine that you'd been through all of that and you'd been treated and you'd got better. how likely is it that you would stick around until September, when you'd been liberated in April, to give evidence at a British trial? Most people wanted to go home and went home. So they left the camp as soon as they could. So what the British were left with were some people who were highly motivated to give evidence because perhaps their family had been killed in front of them. And there was certainly one doctor called Ada Bimco, who was perhaps a star witness. She gave some very good evidence and was highly credible. And then there were, you can go down the sort of line of people whose credibility diminished, if you like, who eventually ended up giving hearsay evidence that one of their friends had told them that this person had hit somebody or beat them or shot them even. So there were quite a few people who gave evidence at the trial, like a dozen or so, but most of the evidence came from affidavits. So this was sworn testimony given to an officer, a British officer, who then wrote it down and had the person sign it. And then they were sort of free to go and they went home. They weren't called as witnesses to give oral testimony in the trial. Normally, that kind of evidence, affidavit evidence, is not read to a court at that time anyway. But they did read them all, and the court was warned to give that evidence the weight that it could be accorded to it, if you like. The reason they were warned is that if you read someone's testimony in court that they'd written down, the defense then can't question it. So if in an affidavit somebody said, this person hit me with a stick, then the defense had no opportunity to say, well, how many times did they hit you? What had you done? Perhaps you deserved it. What date did this happen? The person you've accused was not in the camp at that time. Those kind of questions couldn't be put to the witness.
Well, how do you feel about the UK's treatment of the more etiquette when it comes to real trial and, actually going through with convicting these people? Not only just, I prefer the Winston Churchill method, but it seems like the British people took a different take on it and really try to make it as, as proper as possible in a more humane, I mean, as humane as you can be in those situations, but really try and give them due process in a sense, which, I mean, big respect to you guys, but I mean, what's your take on that when you're reading the horror stories of people in this camps and you see first person accounts of what people had to go through, bodies being stacked on top of bodies and, family members getting shot right in the street as soon as they get off the train car, for instance. That makes you kind of want to prescribe more to the Winston Churchill style of things. You just don't see, there's not any more listening to what they have to say. It's about you guys are going to be persecuted.
Well, I mean, what you're referring to, Churchill, his proposal right at the beginning when they were talking about what they were going to do with accused war criminals was, what he said was, let's get a list of the people we know have done bad things. When one of our officers identifies them, we just take him out and shoot him. But then he softened on that a little bit because he realized that that kind of justice. It
Was
wasn't.
when Russia doubled down with him. He was like, shit, maybe I gotta back it up.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. Yeah. In fact, Stalin did tease him about that, and he backed down on it a bit, and eventually he went completely soft on even war crimes trials, and decided that they weren't a good idea. But the trials themselves, I think, were extremely fair, and certainly this first trial, they used British officers as defence counsel, and the British officers tried really hard to defend their people, went above and beyond the call of duty. When I read all of their summing up statements, and they did their level best to defend these people. Afterwards, the British just couldn't find enough officers who were willing to defend people anymore, and they then used German lawyers to defend them. But certainly in the first Belsen trial, they were very ably defended by British officers, majors and captains usually.
Did you look at the public's perception on just the whole war crimes in general? It seemed like around this time period when camps were being liberated, when I was coming across testimonies from people who experienced either Auschwitz, mostly Auschwitz, but they were talking about how like they couldn't find a home. Nobody would let them in, and it just seemed like everyone just kind of became numb to it, where it was like they just didn't care anymore. Everyone had already been through so much, and the people in the camps had gone through even more, where it wasn't even about human decency anymore.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, a lot of people wanted to go home, but there wasn't a home to go to. So certainly the people in Auschwitz that survived Auschwitz, they wanted to go back to their homes in Poland. Most of them found that houses that had previously been occupied by Jewish people had been taken over by other Polish families who weren't prepared to let them in, or they went back and faced the same anti-Semitism that they had before. And a lot of countries, of course, had been overtaken by the Russians, and people certainly didn't want to go back under that regime, which was seen as, just as harsh as the Nazi regime in some cases. And so they were called displaced persons, and of course, a lot of the Jewish people wanted to go to Palestine, as it was known then, which was under British control. Um, and I don't know much about this aspect of history, but of course, um, Palestine was owned by Arab people, and the British wanted to keep their Arab um, colleagues and allies sweet. Really, they didn't want to send hundreds of thousands of Jewish people there, and so they very tightly controlled the immigration that could be sent. People could be sent to Israel. That whole aspect of it, I really haven't got into yet, but certainly affected all those displaced people.
If I ask what's one thing you learned through research and documentation about Belsen that you haven't been able to find widely available when it comes to like just Googling more about the Belsen trials and looking at information?
Yeah, I mean, Google's pretty good on the Belsen trial, but you can't you can't get a flavor of the testimony unless you read it. And the trial transcript is over 1,000 pages long, and it's very involved. Um, I guess one of the things that I'm trying to think of, one of the things that I've struggled with, or one of the things I've learnt, had to I had to plow through a lot of legalese. I've had to become much more capable of understanding legal terms than I was previously. And yeah, one of the problems I did have was finding a manual of military law. So the British tried people for war crimes. It was a British military court that could only try for war crimes based on a royal warrant. They couldn't try for crimes against humanity, and the royal warrant is based itself on the manual of military law. It's not too difficult to get hold of a manual of military law 2023 or 2024. It's bloody impossible to get hold of one of 1945. Next to impossible. I did find one. Took a lot of digging, and I only have soft copy, but that's been totally invaluable. Really difficult to find.
Now, I want to ask more about one of the other camps, which is Neuengamme, if I'm saying that properly. Um, I want to ask, what was the function of that camp? And then did you start off with Belsen and then come across Neuengamme, or did you know about Neuengamme before Belsen?
Yeah, it was that way around. What if I I did an analysis on the trials, the British trials, and found out that there were nearly 400 trials, but 150 of them had been heard in one location in Hamburg, in the Curio House, which is why my book's called The Curio House Trials. And I contacted the Curio House, and they said, "Sure, come here, and we'll give you a tour, and you can take as many photographs as you like." They were really nice, and I went to Hamburg, and I started to look at the trials that might have involved places around Hamburg, only to find that there were 9 trials for Neuengamme concentration camp, which I'd never heard of. which was only a few kilometers outside of Hamburg. In fact, it's on their subway, so you can get there relatively easily. So I thought, well, I'm going to be in Hamburg. I'll go there as well. And I went to Neuengamme, and that's where I made an appointment to see the director of the archives, and was given such a lot of help there. In fact, I could not have written the book, The Curio House Trials, or my next book, which is tentatively called the Brunswick Triangle Trials, without the help of Neuengamme and that archive. So what was Neuengamme? It was a brickworks, and the Nazis wanted slave laborers to help there. It was dirty and physical job, making the bricks and then taking them down the canals to be shipped to different parts of Germany for building and rebuilding after the destruction by the bombing, of course. And it was a center, if you like, for slave labor, in that there were 80 sub-camps of Neuengamme. It's a huge amount. And imagine, I didn't even know the camp existed, let alone the sub-camps. All these sub-camps were small numbers of slave workers. And I say slave workers because, they were prisoners who'd not
It
been
was
tried.
labor till death. That's what it was.
Yeah, they'd not done anything wrong. They were perhaps taken from occupied countries because they were resistant, or they were Jewish, or they were Russian soldiers. And they would take them to these subcamps to do different kinds of work. Typically, it was the kind of dirty work or reconstruction work that the German civilians didn't want to do, or there weren't enough of them to do it. So there'd be 300 people taken to a subcamp to collect bricks from the streets after a bombing raid, or they would clean out an oil tanker, or there was some horrible stuff that these people had to do, and they got terrible injuries from chemical burns and those kind of things. So, but 80 of those subcamps, they worked in quarries, and you can read about them in my book. There were several British war crimes trials for events that happened in these subcamps of Neuengamme.
Is your book out already?
No, it's still with the publisher. I'm promised that I will see an edited copy fairly soon.
Yeah, you got to
Imagine
send me one when you get one.
what when I
I'll
get
buy one for sure, but just like a PDF or something so I could be able to have you back on to promote it.
oh yeah, sure, well, yeah, of course.
I
You'll be the
want
first.
to I want to ask about Neuengamme and the many different subcamps. Why so many subcamps? I mean, they don't really need that many. They could barely control half of the ones that they had already. I mean, if we notice, the basis of a lot of these concentration camps was they had an extermination issue. They couldn't stop losing people at a point. And it sounds like, well, they had so many people coming in, they were tossing them in the gas chambers. Yeah, well, after a while, they started running out of people. They started getting to a point now where they had way more bodies than they actually had people that were still alive.
Well, you have to differentiate between extermination camps. I mean, certainly the Germans wanted to exterminate the Jews. So they built and they took as many Jews as they could to these camps simply to kill them. That's one. The other sides of the concentration camps were slave labor camps. Well, they didn't mind if they worked you to death. If you died, well, they'd just get some more people. But the idea was that your labor could be used for the betterment of the Reich. So you would help build things, you would help repair things, you would help clean things, you would build rockets, and you would work in ammunition factories, you work in rubber factories, and they could feed you very little, they could house you very simply, and they could guard. If there's only 300 people, that's a lot easier to guard than there are hundreds of thousands in some of the other camps.
You would have to
Not.
have you would have to half that in two because if you have 300 people that are not really eating properly and they're very malnourished and they have a bunch of other things going on, then it would be like 150 people really.
Yeah, but the way they did it was they didn't have SS guards doing all of the work. And this is something that you asked me about earlier, before we came on the air. What they did was they got the prisoners to guard themselves. It's very much like they do in the South American prisons now. I'm sure you've heard of this, where the prisoners are allowed to run the camp themselves. And what they did generally was they found people who were criminals, who they put in prison. They were quite often German people, or people that they felt could be coerced in some way, and they put them in charge of a block, a hut of people. So a certain number of people, they would be responsible for making sure those people um, went to bed at the right time, got up and made their beds, collected the food, divided the food out amongst them, and then were ready to go to work in the day. And if they didn't do that, they were punished themselves. I mean, severely punished. On the other hand, if they did it right, they were given extra rations. So everything was kind of controlled through carrot and stick. There'd be food and more food for those that did the right things, and there would be terrible punishment for those that didn't do the right thing. And it was all done by what they called prisoner functionaries, and they had the word capo. Those are the people that did a lot of the running of the camps. And that meant that you could get a camp of 300 people overseen by maybe 12, 20 SS officers who did virtually nothing except keep an eye on the capos who would do all the work for them. It was a kind of a smart way of doing it.
The reason why I asked that off air was because I had come across a story of this girl named Basha who was stuck in Auschwitz, and she talked about how she was a little girl at the time, but she got her cell moved and separated from her current group to a new group where she had to relearn how to work with these people because everyone at that point, you get to know your group so you can figure out how to survive. And there was a murderer in the group, like that everyone knew about, like that it was that this person murders other people in the group, so be very careful around this person. I was like, damn, you have to worry about the SS guards. Now you have to worry about other people in there that are just doing psychopathic things. I mean, ratting to get not get punished, but if you rat somebody else out and just have them get punished and the blame gets off you, it's more like being a snitch. But imagine being a psychopath inside of a camp of psychopaths, basically.
Yeah, I mean, when I say it was a smart way of running it, I don't mean to say that I'm,
No,
I
I
think,
wasn't hinting at that. I just think it's weird. Nobody ever thinks about that at all. The other psychology that goes into it, which is the people that were inside the camps, obviously have to deal with threats of other people inside the camps.
yeah, I mean, the first people that ended up in concentration camps were political political opponents of the Nazis, of course, the communists and um, people who opposed them on the streets, closely followed by criminals and what they called antisocials, which would be prostitutes and vagabonds. Um, and because they were German, they were treated slightly better when all of the Polish and Russian and French people came in because they were foreigners, weren't they? So, let's give the slightly better jobs to the people who are German, who actually understand our language and can understand exactly what we want them to do, and who will appreciate a bit of sausage at the end of the week. Um, and that way we control all of these horrible foreign people and Jews. And so you ended up with criminals being in charge. Yeah. And like you say, amongst these hundreds of thousands of people went through the camps, there were psychos, psychotic people, and people who were prepared to rat on their fellow prisoners for an extra crust of bread. You really had to watch your back all the way, not only your fellow prisoners, but the capos and then the SS themselves. It was a miracle, and if you survived.
One thing that would influence that would be the factors of starvation. Your tendency for human decency goes out the window. I was pretty surprised at the number of kids that were involved in the camp that were saving up their bread to give to their parents if they ever came across their parents again. Which I was like, a lot of these kids don't even know if their parents are still alive, but they're just hoarding each piece of bread they get at every meal to make sure that if they ever do come across them, either walking side by side in a chain line somewhere, that they would be able to give them bread. And I was like, well, other people took the more drastic action and stole inside of these camps to get from other people, which is a factor I don't think really gets mentioned a whole lot, but it's like the psychology behind it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, of course, that certainly happened. That children thought fondly hoped that they would see their parents again, and therefore saved food for them. In Belsen, the reverse happened, if you like. The women were giving their rations, such as they were, to the children. There were 500 children in Belsen, and the women tried to keep them alive and very often died doing it.
Can I ask what happened during the trials of Neuengamme? What exactly conducted, if it was just one trial, or if there were many trials, and I guess, least to more severe, what were the punishments that the people that were involved in kind of constructing those camps get?
Yeah. There were 9 Neuengamme trials, and they very often start where there was more than one trial with what they call the main trial, the British main trial, which usually involved the most senior people who they had in custody. And they had the commandant of Neuengamme in custody. I'm struggling to remember much about it, and I'll tell you why. When I went to the archive in Neuengamme, the director told me that they were writing a book on the trials. And so I've avoided writing about the Neuengamme trials as much as I can, because they're going to make us superb job of it. They've got all the materials there. So I don't know a lot of detail of the Neuengamme trials themselves. I know there were, I know, for instance, there was a trial of some people who were involved in some killing some children in Hamburg, and that is in my book, at a place called the Bullenhuser Dam.
Now, you say children, you mean babies, right?
No, no, these were children aged between about 3 and 12.
Because I know last time we talked, you mentioned the slaughter of a bunch of babies and stuff like that, but this is separate.
Yeah, remind me of that in a second. I'll come on to that. But the kids who died at the Bullenhuser Dam, they were taken from Auschwitz to Neuengamme for experimentation. There was a guy who thought he could cure TB. The doctor in charge of the Neuengamme camp, he was involved in their deaths, and he was executed himself by the British. He was found guilty at one of the Neuengamme trials and executed, as were some of the guards that helped. The whole thing is pretty disgusting. They were taken and they were given morphine injections, and then they were hanged on the wall. So the noose was put around their neck, and they were hung from pretty much like coat hooks on the wall, for 20 kids. Brilliant museum at the Bullenhuser Dam, ably run by a fantastic curator who was very helpful in giving me information and gave me private access to the museum as well. It's in my book.
Do you want to talk about the babies that we mentioned earlier?
Sure, sure. So we've talked about slave labor in the concentration camps and in the sub camps, but there were also slave labor in factories outside camps and in the farms. So hundreds, thousands of Polish and Russian prisoners were taken back to Germany to work in the fields and in the factories. As the number of people declined in those areas, they were being used in the army and the air force and the navy, of course. And so many of these slave laborers were young women, and eventually nature took its course and they had babies. But to keep them working in the fields and the factories, they couldn't look after these babies, and they certainly couldn't be given time away from their job to look after the babies. So the Nazis had to come up with a way of looking after the babies, which would allow the parents to go back into the fields. So they convinced the parents, the mothers, that the babies would go to children's homes where they'd be looked after. And bizarrely, the women believed it. There were many, many of these children's homes set up where children, barely a few days old, were taken away from the women and put into these homes and told they'd be looked after. And they weren't looked after, of course. They were neglected and allowed to die. And at least 100,000 babies died in these children's homes. The US Army came across several of them and passed the details on to the British when we took over government of the zone. and there were three trials, three British trials for children's homes, for deaths in children's homes. And one of them is in my book because it was tried in the Curio House. Um, you know, incredible that I'd never heard of it before. Children's homes, 100,000 babies dying. Never heard of that before.
Any of
Uh,
them put to death, the people that did that?
I'm trying to think. Yes, yeah.
Should be all of them.
Well, yeah, you'd think so, wouldn't you? But it's like you were saying, the fairness of the trials. You have to prove it. So, for instance, if a baby dies, then you have to say what was the cause of death of that baby. Now, if you've got a doctor's certificate that said the baby died of pneumonia, at, at what point is that murder? Is it murder or is it neglect? And is there capital punishment for the crime of neglect? And in the UK, there isn't. In Britain, there isn't. You have to prove murder to be executed for it. At that time, of course, we don't have execution in Britain anymore. We don't have hanging. So we were very careful about proving that somebody had caused the death or murdered the children, if you like. And only where it could be proved were those people themselves executed. And in some cases, in many cases, the people were out within months. I mean, lots of babies had died, and yet they were free to go back to their own families and even start families
Do you,
shortly afterwards.
do you think with hindsight and the reason why it's important that we teach it through history, that we look at the how a lot of these people were just not forgiven, but they were given light sentences compared to the actions that they committed on the basis of either time, on the basis of resources, on the basis of just public attention? It seems like the reason why we teach a lot now, it's like with hindsight, we're like we would stick through probably every single minute and every trial that happened, but at that time, in that moment, it seemed like everybody was fed up with this thing.
Yeah, well, the trials were public trials, so you could attend the trials. But what you couldn't attend and what's not recorded anywhere are the court's deliberations. So when the judges went back to their chambers to talk about the case and decide whether they would find the defendant guilty or not and what sentence they would give, that deliberation is not recorded anywhere. We don't know why they decided. Um, so in many cases, you might think it's a light sentence, but there was mitigating factors that we're unaware of. I think mostly they got the sentences they deserved, but there was then chipping away at those sentences. So, for instance, if you were tried and found guilty in 1948, but you'd been in custody since 1945, you'd already been in prison for 3 years. So they took that off your sentence. If you'd been sentenced to 12 years, you're now only looking at 9 years. Then what happened a few years later was the government decided that everybody should get a 50% remission. So if you were sentenced to 12 years, you've got 3 years knocked off. Now you've got 9. Now you've got half of that, 4.5 years left to serve. And very often there would be petitions for those people still in prison for release on grounds that either the family couldn't provide for themselves, which I can accept that. Shortly after the war, it wasn't usual for women to be, particularly who had children, to be in work, and they were badly paid. And how could they look after their families? So that was taken into account. And if the person in prison had been ill, that was taken into account. Or if they'd got previous good character. And in effect, Robbie, what happened was people who'd been tried and sent down between 1945 and 1949 were on the streets by 1955. Nearly all of them released by 1955, even if they got a life sentence.
Yeah, I noticed that when I started looking through, like someone would be in jail for or locked up for 15 years, then it would say like, but they were out in like 5 months or they were out in a year or there was something that was, and I get like the cutting off of trials. If I was in that predicament where I was being tried, I would want the time that I was in holding to be accounted for that, but I wouldn't ever be in that position to be in this circumstance. That's the thing, is that there's a large amount of, I think a lot of people think about is that they know they're doing wrong and they know what they did was a horrendous act. And that if you hear a lot of testimony from a lot of those people that were in those camps, not the prisoners, but the actual people, like diaries of people that were actually experimenting on people and stuff like that, they know they were doing wrong and they understood the full justification of punishment that would be allotted to them. But we also just tried to keep them more like, well, that was then and this is now. And that's where I have a conflict with.
Yeah, yeah, I certainly have a conflict too. I believe they should have served the sentence they were given. But of course, we're not living in those times. 80 years ago, um, West Germany was just coming into effect, into being, if you like, and we the West wanted West Germany on our side against the threat that the Russians posed, and to do that, we kind of had to keep them as happy as we could, and part of that was not keeping um, not keeping those prisoners locked up for all of that time. So it was easier to release them. And actually, the public didn't care. They'd lost interest in the trials. They certainly weren't interested in how many people were in prison in 1955. The people that were really interested were those that they'd done wrong against, of course, whose families they'd killed, who'd been experimented on, or whose children had died. And you could quite understand that point of view, I think. And we get that now, don't we? In domestic politics, we get that. We get it here when a person who's been sent down for life. Life very rarely means life in prison here. It usually means 20 years, 25 years. And so when they come up for release, which they do after 2/3 of their sentence, they come up for parole. There's a big outcry in the press. This person killed these people. Surely they should not be let out of prison after 15 years.
Wait, I thought that's what life was 25 years.
Yeah, we do here have something called a whole life sentence, which does mean you're not going to be released. It's usually reserved for multiple murderers or people who have got a psychological problem of some
Why
kind.
don't they just say until death?
Yeah, well,
So
yeah,
it's a little bit less confusing. When I was a kid, I thought someone got life. I thought that meant until they die in jail, but it's like, no, that's 25 years. And they can be out for good scent or good behavior or something like that. I'm like, well, then don't call it life. Nobody's life is 25 years.
yeah. I agree with you. I don't know why they don't change the definition.
Maybe because you can like 25 years in a job, at that point you can retire, I guess. I don't know.
Here, I would say it was the inertia of putting an act through Parliament. So to change the law, you need to get an act through Parliament. And really, most politicians would say they've got better things to do than redefine what life means when they've got a health service in crisis and um, various other things they've got to look after, schools and roads. And
I would hate to be the person to answer that question. What is life? Good God, that's a tough predicament there. But moving on to the next camp, which actually has something similar with the one we just talked about, Neuengamme, Ravensbrück. Now, they had 70 subgroups involved camps, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah, I'm not sure how many subcamps there are, but I'm prepared to accept that most of the concentration camps had lots of subcamps. Yeah, where they were kind of the administration at the main camp was responsible for supplying people and guards. And what they did is they churned the guards. They kind of swapped them between the camps so that they couldn't be corrupted or they couldn't get used to the conditions or whatever.
What would be the purpose of Ravensbrück camp? Or I guess what separates them from the other camps? And then also, um, yeah, just what's the focus of that camp? Because the next question I'm going to ask you it come right after that one.
Sure, sure. Well, Ravensbrück was the women's camp, so that most of the concentration camps had their own women's compound. Men and women were generally separated, although they worked together in some of the subcamps. They actually, they slept and their accommodation huts were separate. But Ravensbrück was specifically for women. It was built by men from Sachsenhausen, another concentration camp. And then I think in 1939, the first women arrived. It was about it's about 50 miles north of Berlin on the side of a lake. And the women there were given work to do the worst work was digging sand and loading sand. Of course, it was outside, and they weren't given any gloves, and it was just awful work. And or they worked in factories, local factories. But it was a terrible place. Ravensbrück was absolutely horrible.
Now, did it have a function to it when it came to just besides something of labor? I read that there was also experimentation that went on at that camp, two types of varying experimentation, which is more about the horrendous stuff I know about the Nazis, which is what they did, which I think a lot of people are unaware of. I believe the first medical experiments in 1942 or the summer of 1942, there are two types of experiments, one testing sulfonamide drugs and the other on muscle and nerve regeneration, which was cutting into bone. Yeah.
Yeah, you got that absolutely right. Yeah, there was experimentation done there on a bunch of young women, or unfortunate women who very often, very often died and certainly suffered terribly because they weren't they called them experiments, but I'm a scientist. They weren't experiments because they were they were unethical, and they were certainly done in a way that the results could not be used to prove anything. The first lot of experiments you mentioned about sulfonamide was a kind of precursor to penicillin. It was an antibiotic, and this was a very strange story about this. Really, the Heydrich, who was the chief SS officer of Czechoslovakia, was executed. Sorry, executed. He was assassinated. Um, and
How did that word skip your head? Come on now.
I know, that's terrible, isn't it? Yeah.
God.
Um, yeah, he was assassinated, but he didn't die immediately. He was taken to hospital, and he got an infection. And the chap that they sent, the doctor, the SS doctor they sent to look after him, didn't believe in sulfonamides, and uh, he died of gangrene essentially. So he wasn't treated properly. And I can't remember the name of this doctor. I'm sorry, it escapes me at the minute. There's a lot of names. I'm terrible for names, which is really bad in this business because, I mean, there's hundreds of names.
Well, if you look at the Germans' names, they're not easy names to remember. I don't blame you.
Thank you. The SS doctor went back to Berlin, and he found himself in trouble because Himmler and Hitler both really liked Heydrich. And basically, the inference was, well, you let him die because you didn't treat him properly. So to prove that sulfonamides weren't very effective, he decided to do these experiments at Ravensbrück, which is why these women they were deliberately wounded in their legs, usually in their legs, and they were infected with bits of wood and glass, and it was awful. And when their wounds became gangrenous or certainly infected, they were treated and hopefully didn't recover because that's what the doctor wanted. He wanted to show that sulfonamide wasn't effective. So those were those experiments, and a bizarre reason why they were done is kind of a negative reason, isn't it? So you're trying to prove a negative. And the other one was done because, of course, army officers, German army officers and infantrymen were being wounded all the time, and they wanted to see whether there was a method that they could use to regrow muscle and bone and nerve tissue. And so they deliberately wounded these poor women and tried to figure out if there was a way they could make that happen in better. And they were ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous experiments. To do an experiment such as that, of course, is totally unethical because you don't experiment on people by wounding them. And even at a base level in an experiment, you need to have a control group that either are not wounded but of course, no scientist is going to wound people to do an experiment. And that was just disgusting, unethical, and unscientific.
Did you think a bit about that differently when we came to forgiving them for their crimes by using their research, like things like Operation Paperclip? I found it weird with Unit 731. They were dropping like heavy objects from high buildings onto people's hands and legs as they were tied to a 4-point board. And they were just testing what certain damage of items would do to the human body. And I was like, what experiment is that? What's the research you get out of that? And it's what they all concluded at the ending when they forgave all those people for their war crimes and realized that everything that they just got is just dumb. It's interesting, sure, but it's not anything that could be valuable. It's just nonsense.
Yeah, absolutely. They weren't experiments in the scientific tradition. They were ridiculous, and I don't know of any of them where the results have actually been useful to scientists afterwards. Um, and they didn't all get away with it. Certainly, the doctor at Ravensbrück, um, Percival Trieta, his name was. Uh, he was sentenced to death. He actually committed suicide. So they didn't all get away with it by any means.
Now, did the at the trial was that brought up about the human experimentation? How was the British government able to handle that or talk about that in a more, it seems like they'd have a more proper way of handling it than America would.
It was brought up, and the US certainly did trials for this as well. What happened was there was a group of the medical people from Ravensbrück were under arrest by the British. Ravensbrück at that time was in the Russian zone, and it would normally have been the Russians who tried them, but because we the British had everybody in all these people in custody, we decided that we would try them. But the Americans asked for 4 people from that group to be given to one of their trials, which was a subsequent Nuremberg trial called the Doctor's Trial. So we allowed those people to be tried by the US. And you can certainly read all about the Doctor's Trial. That's very well documented. You can Google it, and there's certainly a war trials book that's online that you can read about it. So the US definitely did try some of those people for human experimentation, as did the British. We had, just looking at my notes here, we had 7 Ravensbrück trials. There was 1 for the medical staff, and 2 for SS execution squads. So we definitely did try people on that basis. I haven't written about those yet. I think that the Ravensbrück trials probably merits a book of its own.
How many books are you making?
I know it's a lot, isn't it? I said at the beginning there's about 15 years worth. So I wrote the first book. That's with the publisher now. So that's complete. It's just got to be edited into something, polished into something that you would like to read. The second book is well on the way, but I'm still only looking at maybe 30 trials in the first book, maybe another 30 or 40 trials in the second book, and there were 400 British trials. So it's a big a huge seam for me to mine. I think there's probably a book about the SAS, which are our special forces. There were trials for our special forces who were murdered. That's probably a book in itself. Then there's at least one for Ravensbrück, I think. And if Neuengamme don't get their act together and write their own book, I'll write one. So there's one there. So that'll be 4. I think there's probably more after that. I've just got to find an angle. You can't just write about 40 trials that are unrelated. You have to find some way of putting them together so that people can understand why they're particularly important.
Is there a central theme more than the actual camp itself?
Yeah, the central theme really for me is that they're British trials.
So if the central theme is just British trials, have you ever thought about trying to group that in another form as well too? I mean, I'm sure, like you mentioned, you can make a dozens of books on this, but I'm curious if you got 4 already in the book. I mean, are the central theme besides British stuff? Is it more focused into like how do you group the trials? Is it just on the basis of British, or is it just the fact that like they certain instances in these trials that are somehow similar to another trial that they had? Because the three trials at Belsen, I wouldn't call them that similar. There's a like kind of a range with them, but then if you look at like the trials of like if we talked about Neuengamme, I mean, those nine trials that happened, is there any similarities? They all don't really replicate each other. They're kind of unique in their own, but they have one core central bit that might be able to link to another camp.
Yeah, that's right. In the first book, the Curio House trials, what I did was I wrote a chapter on trials for murdering British prisoners of war, for instance. So there were several trials with that theme that I could write about. So the chapters are divided into themes, if you like. So it might be possible to write a book with that kind of theme. You could write a book called British Trials for murders of British prisoners of war, for
Make a
instance.
whole human experimentation book about what the Nazis did at these camps, because I feel like that needs to, I need to find out where we can get more resources to be able to see what extent they went to at these camps. I didn't even know Ravensbrück was one of those until I was reading more about Ravensbrück. I'm like, guys, put this at the top of your thing. You're going to get a lot more people interested.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's at least one book about it, actually by a guy called Lifton. I'm trying to can't remember what it's called.
Is his first name David?
It might be, but it's not that the same one. Um, I forget what it's called,
No,
but
he's an expert in the RFK assassination.
yeah, that's right. No, it's not the same guy who was interested in assassinations. But I mean, you could theme things differently, but if you do that, I think you've probably got to then have access to other archives, which I don't really have. Initially, my access to the archives here because I couldn't travel, and now because I just can't I can't afford to come to the States that often, Where to go to London's £50, to come to the States is going to be £500.
Tell me where to go. I'll go and send you some pictures.
Well, I mean that's an option, to get somebody else who's interested and use them as a research assistant or co-writer or something. That is definitely an option.
Just let me know so I could take my anxiety medication if I have to talk to people.
You'd have to camp in Washington, you know that,
Okay,
DC.
that's fine. I've been there once. Wasn't that bad. There was a couple spots where I was like, don't spend the night here. But
Do you know, I
overall,
like DC. I've been several times, but of course I only go to the tourist places, which are nice. So I don't. I did go to the Ford's Theatre and take a wrong turn because, like all Brits, I was just walking back. I refused to pay to go on the subway.
that's how I am.
Um, and I took a wrong turn and thought, well, I don't really want to be here.
I'm usually good at walking there, and then on the way back, I'm like, all right, let's just call it
Yeah, let's
five.
make
It's,
it easy. I'll get
yeah,
a cab. Yeah,
yeah. Because you end up walking, you're like, damn, we're 50 miles from the hotel. What are we doing?
yeah, I know. I know. It is a big city as well, isn't it? There's plenty to see. But yeah, I mean, you could theme it differently. I just found that what's interested me is that one courtroom could do 150 trials. So that was a natural sort of focus. And then found that the SAS trials of um, our special forces guys, that was in one place, and it was in the Wuppertal Zoo, which was one of the few buildings that was still standing. So I thought and that's kind of an interesting angle, isn't it? It's an easy book to call it the Wuppertal Zoo trials, you know. Um,
I don't know. That name doesn't fit.
sure, it does.
No, it scares me. You say zoo, people think you're talking about the people.
Oh, right, okay. No. Well,
Canceled. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
it'll be on the cover of the book, it'll be on the blurb.
Were you surprised at the number or lack of number of publications on these trials? I mean, to be 100% honest, I was very surprised at the fact that there was barely any on Ravensbrück. I mean, there's one maybe, but there's really focus on Auschwitz and some of the major camps that people know about. But when it comes to getting a historical record, I couldn't find even videos on it where I was like, damn, for someone who is like a visual learner, I need that. So, it's important that you gave me the time to be able to do this conversation, but were you surprised on the lack of publications?
Absolutely, I was. Yeah, just like you. I was stunned that there's hardly any book on any of the war crimes trials outside Nuremberg. Plenty on Nuremberg, um, but I mean, I don't think there is a book on the Auschwitz trial, is there? Um,
There's a bunch of books on Auschwitz, but I don't know if they go into the trials as much.
trial. I mean, the trial was in the early 1960s in Germany. There are books on the trials in German, but they just don't reach translation. So, and I mean, there's a few British books. The one I showed you earlier, this one, is a part of a series that was published in 1948, I think. Um, Half a dozen. This kind of I've got them, but they're not easy to find. I mean, they're 80 years old. They're usually only available in university libraries, and so I was very lucky to get hold of secondhand copies. But there are very few on any of the. Well, I think there's just one on some of the British trials, um, on the Belsen trials, which was a PhD. Pretty sure it was a PhD thesis that made it into a book, and that happened quite often. Actually, people's PhD theses get turned into books, and they're actually quite tough to read because of that. Um, but the other trials, there's I tried to find out US trial books, and very few. They mainly look at the experiences of a prosecutor or a defender, and there you see the trial through their eyes, but you don't get a proper feel for the toing and froing of a trial from prosecution to defense and through deliberation and sentencing. You just don't get the full story, which is what you're after, I believe, and certainly what I'm after. I None of these kind of secondary sources, as they're called, books on trials are good enough for me. I want to see the actual transcript written by the person who took the shorthand in court. And that's what I get when I go to the archives. I get it longhand written in pen. It's amazing.
I love your enthusiasm because I think that's what we need, especially when it comes to people are now going to be able to hit Google, whatever, Ravensbrück or Neuengamme, and be able to hit books, and then they'll see your title up there as one of the ones listed. And relatively, it'll be new when they probably go and search it. So that'll be good for them to be able to look into it and be able to understand it more. And I'm happy that you're enthusiastic about the topic when it comes to just trying to spread the public education and interest into the subject. But Russell, where can people find your links?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram, Russell Kent author. I'm on Instagram and I drop something weekly, usually about one of the trials. I have a website. It's Russell Kent on all one word, Russell Kent .my.canva site .my.canva.site. I'll send it to you, Robbie. And for my book, it will be published by Pen and Sword. They have a website, penandsword.co.uk or .com. I don't think it's listed there yet because it's still in editing, but it'll be there eventually, and you'll be able to buy it.
Well, I'll make sure when it comes out, I'll go back to this episode and put it in the description, and I'll make sure to link all your other links in the description below. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank, and stay tuned for our next episode.